So we've been talking about Rome, book recommendations. If you want to learn more about Rome, this is very good, very readable. Michael Parenti, A People's History of Ancient Rome, particularly focuses on Caesar and his assassination with over 100 stab wounds in the Senate by the oligarchs. So while pagan Rome isn't the cartoon villain show that later Christians presented, it wasn't particularly nice. I mean, we've talked about how ancient Greece was fairly misogynistic. At least in Greece, women got names. In Rome, women got numbers. It was common for your father to just name his daughter first, second, third, and then they'd take the name of their husband when they married. So we had pagan Rome. What I find quite fascinating is the parallels between Rome and India. In both cases, you had an empire operating on a fairly low mode of production, where transport and logistics were quite difficult. That, as Alexander found out to his rage and sorrow, an empire at that scale of technology can only get so big. So the Roman Empire reaches a certain size and it reaches limits and it can't expand anymore. There's a Roman elite which has been profiting from all the conquests, and suddenly they're not getting any more plunder and they want to remain in the style to which they've been accustomed, which means they have to extract more from the territories they've conquered. This happens at the same time as the introduction of a new belief system, Christianity, which is very similar to what happens to the empire of King Akosha or Ashoka, I'm not quite sure, in India. Anyway, his empire reaches the limits of its expansion, and once it's done this, the rate of plunder of the occupied territories gets increased, and this corresponds to the spreading of a religion of peace. In the case of India, that's Buddhism. There's this new belief system of peace, love, mercy, forgiveness, but you look at the reality and you get a much crueler, much more violent world. St. Paul, artistically depicted here, he's going around and he's spreading Christianity in the days of pagan Rome. St. Paul probably wasn't a historical character, but nevertheless some of the stories, the social system is accurately depicted, despite the tales being fiction. So he falls into the clutches of evil Jews, and they're going to subject him to judicial torture. Judicial torture is the sort of torture where questions are asked with a view to obtaining a confession and a criminal conviction. And St. Paul's like, no, you can't do this to me, I'm a Roman citizen. And they're like, oh right, we can't, no, you're a Roman citizen. Roman citizens were, under pagan Rome, exempt from judicial torture. This changes under Christianity. Under Christianity, everyone is subject to judicial torture. Previously, relatively unheard of, mutilations, having your body mutilated in an ugly and visible way, becomes a common criminal punishment when it wasn't before. Everyone who used to have legal rights has their legal rights stripped away, and this goes hand in glove with this new belief system of love your torturer, pray for those who persecute you, forgive, whatever you do, don't seek revenge. That's the reality of it. What did ancient Greece have that we don't? I mean, we've talked a lot about the modern things that we have that ancient Greece was the precursor to. Hang on, let's go back. I have more to say. I'm a bit confused. We can edit this.
Sure.
And so, I mean, talks before about America and the American slave trade. John Locke, the philosopher of liberty, as he's known, the philosopher whose writings were foundational of the American Constitution, made his fortune speculating on the Atlantic slave trade. I mean, is Christianity important now that most people don't believe in it? I mean, a big part of why I'm giving this talk, why I think ancient Greece is important, is that we don't realise how influenced we've been by Christian ideas. Despite the fact, even if we don't believe in Christianity, we've been raised in a culture where Christian ideas saturated, and like liberalism takes, you know, these foundational ideas of Christianity, choice, free will, the individual, these ideas that are just completely inaccurate when it comes in the understanding of neuroscience or psychology are foundational to our culture. These ideas of, individualism, free will, choice form the basis of American ideology of the philosophy of liberalism, which remains incredibly powerful and dominant even if Christianity isn't anymore. We've talked a lot about how in many of the good things we have today were developed in ancient Greece, whether that's democracy, whether that's science. They're all right, but they had slaves, and so it was like us, but it wasn't quite as good. I don't think that's accurate. I think the Greeks had a lot that we don't. It's above all they had self-respect. They didn't have this ideology of guilt. They didn't feel guilty all the time. They didn't feel the need to work all the time. Morality, as it was understood by the ancient Greece, was just advice on how to live a happy life. It wasn't about fulfilling some duty that made you miserable, and that being miserable and stressed was a badge of honour. That just appeared really, really wonky to them. They were very free sexually. I mean, even under pagan Rome, in the Roman military, male homosexuality was punished by being whipped to death. And the sort of persecutions against that sort of thing became even worse under Christianity. They didn't have nationalism. There was no, even when the whole of Greece was at threat of conquest by Persia, there wasn't this coming together and let's form a Greek nation. The cities allied when it was in their military interests to do so, and that was all there was to it. I mean, you can find traces of nationalism in Plato, whose ideas were very different to the ideas common in ancient Greece, but not really beyond that. This is Friedrich Nietzsche once again. Do we have a Nietzsche in the room?
The Greeks did not require conceptual hallucinations, for among them the idea that work is a disgrace is expressed with startling frankness.
There we go. And you can learn a lot from a language. This is the Greek word ponos. It means both work and pain. Same word. I mean, work might sometimes be necessary, but it's not something to value or celebrate. I mean, the Greek attitude to work is, I suppose, similar to the modern attitude to killing and war. Most people see that sometimes it's necessary to kill people, as ugly and horrible as that may be. But to celebrate it, that would be disgusting, that would be mad. And the Greeks felt the same way about work. Here we have the author of Class Struggle in Ancient Greece. I recommend it very highly. We've got a Dies de Croix in the room. No. Students of Greek thought are fortunate in that this obfuscating, which means confusing, murkying, notion of the individual rarely appears in antiquity, and can hardly be expressed in Greek. So this idea that is foundational to modern political philosophy wasn't an idea that the people who invented direct democracy had. It can hardly be expressed in Greek, and we see it developing in Christianity. It's just the impotence of it, of splitting people off, of making people look inwards. I mean, the Greeks would have just been confused by it. Yeah. Hang on.
Okay.
Oh no, I really shouldn't have stopped. This makes me lose my train of thought a lot. Yeah, so I mean, some people might say, oh, well that's why they had slavery, because they didn't revere the dignity of the individual. Which I think, you can think that until you see how slavery was practiced by liberals and Christians. And I think it's worth pointing out why slavery ended in America is not because Americans were moral and they overcame, this shameful thing from their past that didn't really fit. Slavery in America was a military liability. America was engaged in the 19th century. America was engaged in a sort of Cold War with Britain. Britain and America constantly squaring up, fighting over, dominance over various, America wanted complete control of half the world, of the American hemisphere, of Latin America, their backyard, and they wanted the British out. But if it ever came to war, Britain could just raise a black army in Jamaica, set them loose in the American South, freeing slaves, burning plantations. It'd be very easy for Britain to cause absolute carnage in the event of a war with America, which put America in a weak position when it came to squaring up to Britain. And that is why the Northern American people like Abraham Lincoln, were so keen to abolish slavery. It was simply because it was a military liability. Yeah. Can we? You're on your phone. Alright, here we have Oscar Wilde, the legendary one and only.
Alright. The fact is that civilization requires slaves. The Greeks were quite right there. Unless there are slaves to do the ugly, horrible, uninteresting work, culture and contemplation become almost impossible. Human slavery is wrong, insecure, and demoralizing. On mechanical slavery, on the slavery of the machine, the future of the world depends. Socialism will be what the Greeks sought for, but could not, except in thought, realize completely because they had slaves and fed them. It will be what the Renaissance sought for, but could not realize completely except in art, because they had slaves and starved them. It will be complete, and through it each man will attain to his perfection.
Oscar Wilde's brilliant essay, The Soul of Man Under Socialism. If you've not read it, I really recommend it. To conclude, this is what I think. I think there's an enormous amount that we can learn from Greek culture. It shows us that while the Greeks didn't get everything right, and they got a lot wrong, that the way we think in modern Western society is not the only way. Liberalism is not the only way. A morality that, while we may not believe in God, just echoes Christian morality. It's not the only way. We need to reevaluate our morality. We need to transvaluate our values, as Nietzsche put it. And on that note, Nietzsche will be our next talk. Any questions? Alright, any questions?
I have one. Why do you think that ancient Greece and the ancient world in general get toffs so excited? Like Boris Johnson, who absolutely adores the classics, and yet these people kind of come out with views which don't fit very well with some of these ideas that you've been expressing, like equality and democracy and things like that.
Okay, well, I guess for one thing, it's because most of what we know about ancient Greece comes from Roman writers. It's like paper doesn't survive for that long. And it was sort of passed through Rome, which had a very different culture to Greece. I mean, the reason that Greece is the one we pick rather than, say, Scythia, where you had warrior women, you had women in a much higher position than Greece. Greek culture survived Roman conquest for interesting reasons. It was one of the first cultured societies that Rome conquered. Its culture really didn't mesh with Rome, and it made the Roman elite decide that they would just destroy the culture of future conquests. So Greece was kind of lucky to survive, and the sort of Roman writers that transmit it are people like Boris Johnson, Cicero. Karl Marx called him, or maybe it was Engels, one of them, called him the most despicable personality of history. He was a new man, he was new money, which was rare in Rome, and he was constantly trying to prove himself to his betters by figuring out ways that they could keep the rabble down. He exerted himself running around giving speeches. Cicero is where we find the strongest contempt for the mob, but his betters, they never recognised him, they always just snubbed him. Yeah, quite. If you want more about Rome, again, Parenti is great. The other reason is because we don't have anything from Greece written by poor people. It all comes from the Toffs. So you have the Toffs of ancient Greece, and that's all that there is to read from ancient Greece. And if people just take it at face value, modern Toffs, yeah, there's a startling continuity of attitudes. It actually takes a bit of cunning to get the sort of view that I've presented, simply because the record is so patchy. Give me a moment. There was a point I really wanted to make here. This is terrible.
Don't worry.
Yeah, we can edit out this way too. Yes, Aristotle. What's really struck me reading Aristotle was how much Marx cribbed. Aristotle is it's like Marxism backwards. I mean, Aristotle's book Politics is essentially a guide for oligarchs on how to keep the rabble down. But the analysis is pretty much Marxism. The analysis is the same, it's just the objectives are different. So yeah, I hope that answers the question. Any other questions?
I can't remember what I asked last time, but I remember you answered it really well. Oh, it was just about direct democracy, and I think it just ended up being a detailed question, but I was curious about what kinds of issues would be put to direct democracy versus what kinds of things would be people's responsibility, and how is that managed, maybe that's too kind of small a detail, but I was interested in this idea of, if you're in the assembly voting versus kind of having certain jobs assigned to different people,
Yeah.
what kinds of things would be a job versus what kinds of things would be voted on by citizens?
The answer is I haven't studied ancient Greece enough to give you a definitive answer. But I think that, if you've got enough people behind something, it came to the assembly, no matter what it was. It's issues of class struggle very, very commonly appeared in the assembly. There was actually once, after a long and bloody war, Athens had to import grain, otherwise it would starve. And one of their cities that was part of their empire had rebelled, and the assembly was terrified, and this guy Cleon got them all incensed, and they decided, yes, kill all the men, sell all the women and children as slaves to teach everyone else their place. That was decided in the assembly. And then off they sent off a ship to give the orders. And then the next day, everyone's like, shit, what have we done? We can't do this! And they were like, quick, send another ship with like a huge number of oarsmen to row really, really fast and get there first. Just kill the leaders. And they got there first.
Ah. That's a really good example. I mean, do you think that if we're talking about, so Peter Hallward, he's like, I think he's a Canadian thinker.
Mm-hmm.
He talks a lot about ancient Greece and also about French and Haitian revolutions,
Mm-hmm.
and talking about the idea of like mass sovereignty versus representative democracy.
Yeah.
I suppose something like an Athenian direct democracy, as well as this kind of picking people by law,
Mm-hmm.
would be closer in some ways to the idea of mass sovereignty. Question mark?
Internet would make it a lot easier.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Mass sovereignty all the way.